Kalispera from Athens, Kalispera in England, Kalimera in the US. Thank you for attending our third session in CYA's virtual lecture series from wherever you are. We are coming to you live from CYA's Academic Center, actually the CYA's library upstairs in this house, and from a 17th century cottage in Hertfordshire in the Welsh marshes. It's at the border of Wales and England. Indeed, a virtual lecture series. I'm glad to see so many familiar faces again. This means that we are in good shape and we are gaining in popularity. As I had explained in our inaugural address, virtual lecture a month ago, the idea of these lectures came to us when COVID-19 forced us to close down and lose our student body overnight. We thought then we should create another forum to pass on to others the wisdom of many people associated with the school. As I said then, between our faculty, our former faculty, our alumni, our trustees, our advisors, our students, there are very many who have a lot to say, very interesting things to say, a lot of wisdom to share with us. So this is the whole point of this lecture series. Today's lecture walks us through Athens in the footsteps of the early travelers. The topic, travels to Athens from Cyriac to Baedeker. The presenter, CYA professor Robert Pitt. Robert Pitt is a Greek historian and epigraphist. He's an epigraphist of the classical and Hellenistic periods, whose research interests include the Athenian Empire, Athenian topography, and the financing and administration of public buildings, public building projects rather, in the ancient Greek world. His latest research includes a new corpus of the Athenian funerary monuments of the British Museum and a series of publications on early travelers to Greece, which is what he will talk to us today about. Travelers whose archival papers are at the British Library. As a site epigraphist, he has worked in various places, including Greece, Turkey, and Albania. Robert has taught at CYA since 2014, following 7 years as assistant director of the British School at Athens. Introducing the subject and hopefully wrapping it up at the end, after channeling to him the questions that you may want to put down in your chat box, will be Christine Harrison, coming to us from the West Midlands. As we said, I asked Christine if she's just there hiding from COVID-19, and she just, no, there are other reasons that have taken her to such a remote part of the world. Christine holds a PhD from the University of Birmingham, the UK, on contemporary literary presentations of the early modern period. Her current research interests center on representations of space and place in contemporary fiction and literary nonfiction, uses of the past in contemporary debates on gender and ethnicity, rewritings of medieval and early modern literature, and the role of on-site learning in higher education, something which we do a lot of in this institution, as you all know. At CYA, she's both a member of the faculty and the academic skills advisor, and also teaches a summer course on travel writing in a very nice place that I'd like to be at, which is Poros right now. Anyway, let me remind you again that this session is being recorded and the discussions will be archived for future use. So anyone who does not want to be recorded, please turn off your video cameras. Lastly, we want to wish you all good health, during this difficult period. It will be a good day when we all can get together again and do not have to meet virtually anymore, but reunite in hopefully in Greece. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Philactopoulos, and thank you for your introduction and also for this initiative. And I know both myself and Robert Pitt are excited to be participating this evening. So just before I go through some housekeeping and tell those watching and listening a little bit more about how you can participate and contribute to the discussion after Robert's presentation. I'd just like to say a little bit about how I became intrigued about that aspect of Robert's course which connects to the particular topic of today's lecture and discussion. So when I first joined CYA and was preparing to do the travel writing course, that was when I discovered that there was actually this really fascinating aspect of Robert's course, which is the Topography and Monuments of Athens course, in which the class actually looks at the writing done by travelers about Athens. And of course, as Robert Pitt is going to explain in more detail, this is an invaluable way of actually finding out information about both antiquities and topographies, which may have been later lost or distorted. But I think it's also a very interesting way of looking at the history of ideas as they have shaped representations and ideas about Athens and about Greece, which have been so important in so many different cultures and are still relevant to debates that are continuing today. For example, the debate about the Parthenon marbles and the return of the Parthenon marbles to Athens in Greece. And I think for any of you who've actually visited Athens and Greece, as I'm sure most of our viewers have, this is also not just a look into the past, but also an exploration you'll find of many of the ideas and thoughts that you will have encountered about Greece and about Athens, as well as a look at the experiences of the city by those from the relatively distant past, but still relevant to the present. But let me not continue this any further. I will hand over now to our speaker, Robert Pitt, who is going to introduce the main lecture. The discussion will follow. Before I do so, however, let me just remind you that you could submit your questions using the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And as soon as Robert concludes the lecture, we'll then get on to as many questions as we can. To those of you watching us on Facebook Live, you can also submit your questions using the comments section, and we'll try to get onto as many of those as well. And as Mr. Philactopoulos said, this is being recorded live, and a recording will also be sent to all people who've registered within 48 hours of the lecture. We would appreciate your feedback, suggestions and comments, so please do forward these to CYA's Development Office. So I'd now like to pass the floor to Robert Pitt for his lecture on travels to Athens from Cyriac to Baedeker. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you everyone for joining. For those in the wider CYA community, unable, of course, at the moment to travel, I've put together this presentation on a history of journeying to Athens, focusing on travel literature and the development of guidebooks to the ancient and contemporary city. So let us begin. Historians and archaeologists of Athens rely heavily on the observations of travelers from the Renaissance onwards. They provide a mine of information on now damaged or entirely lost antiquities, natural topographies obscured by later urban development, as well as the dress, culture, and language of the city's inhabitants. These travelers form a fascinating group of merchants, grand tourists, diplomats, scholars, artists, and relic hunters. They were almost exclusively Western Europeans, and most came armed with a classical education. But many left disappointed with the meagre village they found clustered around the north and east slopes of the Acropolis, their progress impeded by what they saw as ignorant priests and corrupt Turks. But they were captivated by the great marble monuments remaining from antiquity, and their published accounts spurred others to follow in their footsteps. In the Byzantine world, Christian pilgrims had flocked to Athens, as its cathedral of the Theotokos Atheniotissa, the converted Parthenon, was one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the empire. The most prolific set of writings about the city from this time comes from the Metropolitan Bishop of Athens, Michael Honiates, from the late 12th century. He wrote scathingly of the city in his day, from his residence atop the Acropolis, which alone was singled out for praise, seeming as it did to bestride the very peak of heaven, as he writes. But in 1204, the capture of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade resulted in the dividing up of Greek lands among the conquering knights. And within a year, the unhappy lot fell to Honiates to deliver the city over to the Burgundian Otto de la Roche as the first Duke of Athens. It was during the following 2.5 centuries of Frankish rule, as these various European elites were called, that our first Western travelers came to Athens. The most influential was the indefatigable Cyriacus of Ancona, a merchant and amateur scholar who took great pleasure in the monuments of antiquity over his many years of extensive travels around the Eastern Mediterranean. Cyriacus was in Athens twice, in 1436 and 1444, and although only a fraction of his manuscript letters and diaries have survived, his contribution has led him to be called the father of classical archaeology. He sketched and described the Olympion, the Hephaestion, the Parthenon and Propylaea, and many other monuments, and is frequently the earliest source we have for buildings and inscriptions from the ancient polis. He is a prime example of an Italian humanist and antiquarian, picking among the ruins in order to record and explain the physical remains of a great classical heritage. Sponsored by cardinals and popes, Cyriacus at the very end of his life may even have been in the camp of Mehmed the Conqueror at the fall of Constantinople in 1453, witnessing firsthand that watershed moment in world history. His writings preserve a unique snapshot of Athens just before the Frankish dukes surrendered the city in their turn over to succeeding overlords in 1456, when the Ottoman conquest would throw an iron curtain over Athens that very few outsiders would penetrate for the next 2 centuries. So much so that one German classicist, Martin Krauss, was moved in 1573 to write to Greek correspondents in Istanbul to ask whether the city of Athens actually still existed. Academic curiosity for Athens was not, however, dampened by the lack of autopsy on the ground, and scholars continued in Europe to gather together information from ancient literature on the city. One of the most successful was the Dutch philologist Johannes van Meurs, or Mercius, as he is in Latin, who in the early 1600s produced collections of ancient texts related to Athens that all self-respecting travelers to the city would bring with them for generations, wandering the city, trying to link these snippets of writings with the remains they could see on the ground, a topographic game that would endure. Athens' isolation under the early centuries of Ottoman rule gradually relented during the 17th century, in part due to improved French diplomatic and economic relations under Louis XIV, the Sun King. The Turkish victory at the Siege of Candia, Crete, in 1669 ended a protracted war with Venice, and diplomatic missions were soon thriving, such as that of the French ambassador to the port, the Marquis de Nointel, who you see here in a portrait he had painted during his visit. He had a thirst for classical antiquity and a collecting zeal, visiting Athens in November 1674, together with an extensive entourage of antiquaries, stonemasons who came with their own equipment for removing marbles, and artists, including one we once identified, but are now not quite sure, as Jacques Carré, whose drawings of the Parthenon sculptures provide invaluable testimony for the monument before that tragic explosion of 1687, when Venetian cannon struck the gunpowder stores kept inside. Part of the preliminary research in Paris for Nointel's visit involved a correspondence with a French order of Capuchin monks who had established a mission at Athens in 1658. And you see the monastery here with a monk drawn in the mid-18th century by Stuart. This monastic complex, now destroyed, incorporated the Lysiquities monument into its fabric, in fact into its library, and provided shelter for travellers in a town devoid of hotels. One of the more famous guests was Lord Byron, who wrote part of his epic poem Childe Harold here. And the monks are also said to be the first in Greece to plant the tomato, which seems to have enjoyed some success. The Capuchins were keen antiquarians and prepared the first plan of the ruins of Athens, which they freely distributed. It would provide the basis for a number of published plans of the city in later travel books, as each visitor tried to trace more of the ancient remains and produce ever more elaborate, if not necessarily more accurate, maps. Travel writing on Greece entered a new era with the visit of the French doctor Jacob Spon and the English cleric George Wheeler. Spon, a medical doctor, was a talented classicist and antiquarian whose interest in Athens was piqued when he received a manuscript from a Jesuit priest, a missionary living in Turkey, Jacques-Paul Babin, on the antiquities of Athens from a first-hand series of visits that the Jesuit had made. Spon saw the work through to publication in Lyon, in 1674, one of the first such eyewitness accounts of its kind dedicated to Athens. And this experience led Spon to travel to Rome, where he soon met with the Englishman Wheeler, and they decided to travel together to Greece, initially with two further Englishmen, Giles Eastcourt and Francis Vernon. But the two pairs separated at Zakynthos, and the latter did not fare well. Eastcourt died of a fever on his way to Delphi, and Vernon was murdered in Isfahan over an argument about a penknife, a reminder of the ever-present dangers of travel in the East. While in Venice, Spon had received a copy of a curious volume, purportedly by a Frenchman well acquainted with the situation at Athens, called La Guilletière, whose letters home to his brother were published. His brother's name was Guillet de Saint-Georges. But this was in fact a total fabrication of Saint-Georges, cobbled together from classical texts, correspondence with the Capuchin monks in Athens, and indeed their map, and sheer flights of fancy. The book, however, proved immensely popular during a period of great interest in the mysterious East, running in 2 years to 3 editions and an English translation, and encouraging Guillet to compose an equally spurious account of a journey to Sparta. He never travelled to Greece. Spon and Wheeler had the book with them during their explorations of Athens in 1676, and Spon would expend much energy and ink over the remainder of his short life in a heated and much publicized polemic with Guillet, who adamantly stuck by his fantasy, even accusing Spon of being the one never to have stepped foot in Athens. Spon then brought out his own account of his Greek travels in 1678, a work of great integrity and learning that would place Athenian topographic research on a firm scientific footing. Spon was well acquainted with the ancient literature, combining primary sources and observations of monuments and landscape with critiques of previous scholarship, and including a great many inscriptions recorded both by himself and others, a basic topographic methodology that would be imitated by many who followed. Wheeler's version of their travels, A Journey into Greece, was published in 1682, with an important map you see here of Attica, that he created using a mariner's compass to take triangulations from the tops of hills of the landscape, an important piece of cartography. The greatest single contribution, arguably, of any mission for the topography and monuments of Athens was in the following century, the work of James Stuart and Nicholas Revett. These architects and artists had again met in Italy, where, in mingling with the grand tourists and diplomats of the day, they were able to raise funds to extend their journey to Greece. And between 1751 and 53, they set about with the professed aim of striving for empirical truth and accuracy in recording the standing architecture of Athens in a level of detail that had not previously been attempted, producing superb architectural plans of the principal remains, as well as beautiful views of the city and aspects of contemporary life. The first of eventually 5 magnificent folio volumes, The Antiquities of Athens, was published by the Society of Dilettanti in London in 1762, and their influence was profound and helped to fuel the classical revival in the West, with versions of Greek temples and copies of the caryatid porch of the Erechtheion or the Lysikrates monument popping up in the architectural landscapes of both Britain and America. Stuart and Revett's mission has preserved for us several monuments that would later be damaged or indeed lost entirely, such as you see here in Stuart's drawing of the Ionic temple from the 5th century BC of Artemis Agroterra above the Ilissos River. The building was in large part still standing in the 1750s, having been converted into a church, but was subsequently demolished to construct the last circuit wall of Athens, built under the Ottoman governor Haseki in 1778, an act of vandalism that would also claim a bridge over the Ilissos opposite the stadium outside CYA, and the facade of the Aqueduct of Hadrian in Kolonakis Dexameni. The success of Stuart and Revett's work led the Society of Dilettanti to raise funds for a sponsored expedition to record the antiquities on the west coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and in Greece, with Richard Chandler at its head, a talented classicist and epigrapher from Oxford. Chandler was joined by Revett again, and the painter William Pars, whose work you see here. The group set out for the East on the 2-year mission in 1764, spending longer, fortunately for us, in Athens than planned when a plague broke out around Smyrna. Chandler's 2 volumes of travel diaries from this mission would run to several editions and translations, demonstrating a wide public interest in classical lands, and they would act as guidebooks for travelers to Asia Minor and Greece for well over a century. There is even a bootleg Irish edition. Chandler's approach was logical and scientific, if not exactly page-turning. He moves from the literary texts to the notices of earlier travelers before expounding on the present state of the ruins, peppered with less than complimentary comments on the modern inhabitants, food, wine, and habits. At the turn of the 19th century, only a handful of travelers had written about Athens. But the 2 decades leading up to the War of Independence witnessed an explosion of travel to Greece, fueled by romantic ideas about the West's classical heritage. Poets, painters, and grand tourists poured into Athens, a great many publishing their own accounts. Most would differ fundamentally in outlook from their 18th century predecessors, who can seem dry and scholarly in comparison to the new wave of travelers in search of the beauty and inspiration of Hellenic lands. Some stand out, however, for their contribution to Athenian topography, such as the Irishman Edward Dodwell, whose superb detailed views preserve a uniquely accurate account of the contemporary city. Perhaps the most remarkable of these early topographers was Colonel William Martin Leake, whose travels for decades around the Eastern Mediterranean as a soldier, diplomat, prisoner of war, and antiquarian provided the basis for several volumes on ancient Greece, which corrected with military precision the errors of previous travelogues. His work on Athens remained a foundational text up to the topographic studies of Walter Judach in the earlier 20th century. The writings of travellers of the 18th and 19th centuries are full of tales of woe and deprivation. Travelling was certainly not easy and required a host of servants and guides and luggage that had to contain, amongst many other things, bedding, mosquito nets, drawing equipment, and horse saddles. Some even brought small libraries with them. A very real problem was where to stay. Athens had no hotels before the 1830s, and visitors could either reside in the Capuchin Monastery, as we saw earlier, or else would throw themselves on the hospitality of the French or English consul in the town until a house or room could be rented. These diplomats, most often local Greeks, acted as guides, hosts, interlocutors, bankers, and indeed antiquities dealers. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the English consulship was often held by a Greek family called Logothetes, whose mansion, seen here, drawn by Stuart, near the Library of Hadrian, hosted Stuart and Rivette, and even Lord Elgin, together with his marbles, for a period. No diplomat, however, would be more influential for the study and collecting of Athenian antiquities than Louis Sebastian Fauvel, seen here in a painting in his rather wonderful house with view over to the Acropolis, surrounded by a number of the antiquities, including, you see there, a slab of metope from the Parthenon that peppered his house. His detailed records of the city's surviving remains provide crucial documentation before much of Athens was destroyed in the ensuing War of Independence. During the war, much of the urban fabric of the city was bombarded from the Acropolis garrison, and the houses in the lower city were set ablaze by one side or another over many years, resulting in an almost total devastation. Fauvel's house and its ancient contents were destroyed, only to be discovered again over a century later during the American school excavations in the Athenian Agora. Another period of travel impossibility necessarily followed. But with the foundation of the new nation state and a burgeoning of city infrastructure in the 1830s, Athens once again opened its doors. Enter the first actual guidebook in the modern sense, in English at least, to include Athens, produced by the London publisher John Murray in 1830, a handbook for travellers in the Ionian Islands, Greece, Turkey, Asia Minor, and Constantinople. Almost 200 years since Spon and Wheeler, travellers are still hindered by the same issues, including, I'm afraid rather too relevant for today's times, quarantine. They say of quarantine, this is the greatest annoyance to which travellers in the East are exposed on their return to Europe. It is rigidly enforced and can by no means be evaded, unlike today. The length of quarantine varies according to the circumstances of the time and is regulated by the absence or existence of plague. It rarely exists 40 or is less than 10 days. Passengers arriving by merchant vessel must perform 14 days quarantine in a lazaretto, the sort of ancient, last century equivalent of the quarantine hotel. There was one, in fact, in Piraeus, and if you didn't stay there, you could stay on board your vessel for 21 days. I suppose that would be the equivalent of staying on board your airplane, not perhaps possible for 3 weeks. This guidebook contains many fascinating insights into the state of Greece in the decade after the war, when the old difficulty of finding somewhere to stay was still a factor. The guide continues, the Turks erected khans at convenient distances throughout the country and maintained them for the reception of travellers, but they were all destroyed during the late war. Since the restoration of tranquility, some of them have been repaired by some poor local families who reside in them and have generally a small supply of wine, bread, olives, and spirits of the country called raki, which they sell to travellers, and I'm reliably informed they still might. Only one hotel is recommended in the entire city, run by a Venetian family, although we do know that at least one other existed, the Aeolos Hotel on today's Aeolus Street, the shell of which you see here, it still survives, And as recently its basement and its gardens have been excavated, it overlays the Roman Agora and the Library of Hadrian. And an advertisement from the late 1830s offers its guests European cuisine and European wines, so you didn't have to bother with that local raki stuff. But of course, the most famous series of guidebooks for travelers from the late 19th and well into the 20th centuries are the little red Baedekers, the German Baedekers, the first English edition for Greece being published in 1889 and containing information collected amongst others by the most eminent archaeologists of the day, such as Lolling and Dürpfeld, who worked with Schliemann and indeed excavated part of the Acropolis. Athens, though, was now only 4 days from London, compared with the almost 2-month journey of the 17th century. Travellers are still warned, though, about the privations they will face and are advised only to eat at the foreign hotels. Baedeker says, the ordinary wine of Greece, partly to increase its keeping power and partly from a curious freak of taste, is impregnated with resin, which foreigners rarely learn to appreciate, end quote. I suspect Baedeker would not be happy to hear that Retsina is making a comeback today. One quite novel addition to this guide is an extensive section on the contemporary Greek language by the learned the Irish classical scholar Mahaffy, for those no longer travelling with an entourage of servants, although his list of useful phrases still portends trouble ahead with local guides. He offers translations of, for example, whither are we going? Do you know the way? Have you often made the journey? Guidebooks have, of course, proliferated ever since and moved from print to Kindle to TripAdvisor and beyond. But the same anxieties and excitements of travel can be recognized in their predecessors centuries ago. And with luck, it won't be long before more of you are back here poring over restaurant reviews and guidebook in hand, tripping over the ancient remains. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that fascinating trip through time, bringing us up to date and stressing the relevance of so many things which seem to be in the past but are still very relevant to the present. I would just like to remind everybody viewing today that they can now send questions, any questions they have about the topic, the discussion, the talk, the visuals, and we will make them the basis for discussion. Just to start us off while the questions come in, Robert, these Western European travellers that have been this focus and that came to the city when they were able to come to the city over this very long period when things, as you pointed out, were very difficult in travel terms and they didn't speak the language and there were all sorts of dangers that they might face as well. What ultimately, they came maybe to see the antiquities, they were interested in ancient Greece, but what are the kind of factors behind that? I mean, what significance was, what role did Greece and Athens play in their own identities? And how do you think this sense of the importance of the city to identities across the Western world and not just in the Western world, how did that maybe change through time in terms of the movement, maybe from Enlightenment to Romanticism? Maybe we could start with that discussion.
Of course, in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, the foundation of education, of course, was a classical education. Elites, at least, knew all the Greek and Latin texts. And much of this is on the back of the Grand Tour. It was quite common, if you had the money, you'd send your sons off to do the Grand Tour of Europe, often by land through Germany, Switzerland, and into Italy, in order to educate yourself, pick up the latest fashions, improve your languages, meet all sorts of people, and go and have a look at the antiquities. But of course, that was really in Italy. You couldn't do that in Greece. Greece was very late to the game as far as the Grand Tour, because of that Iron Curtain that went up across the Ottoman Empire. So you don't really, as we see, get a great many travelers coming. But those that do, of course, much for the same reasons. They tend not to be, I wouldn't quite call them grand tourists. Most of them are here quite specifically for the antiquities. They do want to see what's left of this city that they've read so much about from childhood. And what I find so interesting about the ones that come to Greece, I have to say, the ones that went to Italy often had a very bad reputation. The Society of Dilettanti that we mentioned, Horace Walpole very famously said about them that they were all drunk, and that's really the only reason that they met. Slightly unfair, and they certainly do try and rehabilitate themselves by sponsoring these missions like Stuart and Rivette, not Stuart and Rivette, like Rivette and Pars and Chandler. But when a lot of these people come to Greece, they're particularly taken with what is new. What's so wonderful about reading these travelogues is that they're just astonished at what they come across. Yes, they're sometimes disappointed, not enough of this building survives or the meager state, but in general, they're quite amazed by the place and what does survive. And they want new things. I did a project recently trying to look at the origins of epigraphy. Why do these travelers start looking at inscriptions, and why do they record them? And it's very difficult to find a beginning of it. I thought it would sort of appear at some point, maybe in the 18th century. Not a bit of it. From the very beginning, from Cyriac, in fact, in the 15th century, they're recording inscriptions. And it's because of the newness of it. They can read Greek, of course. They find inscriptions difficult because they're damaged and so on. But they realize that they've got new Greek in them. They've got an element of something completely novel. And that's particularly interesting about them. And indeed, when they go home and they either write up their travels or they join societies like the Dilettanti Society, but across Europe, there were large amounts of these academic, amateurish, some of them societies, that met to discuss the travel writings, the inscriptions, the vases that you brought back with you. It did an awful lot to educate people back in the homelands.
Right. Okay. So there was already that sense of connection. I mean, people's connection through their education, a particular background and classes, maybe of the people who would do the grand tour and those who would venture even to Greece, the sense of the importance of Greece and classical civilization to their own sense of history and identity. But there was this great excitement at being able to develop that narrative in some way to add to that. And also that also being very significant to your developing sense of self in relation to that. We have some interesting questions that have come in. The first one is from Yanis Ioannidis. He says, in the period you discussed, there were only male travelers. When do memoirs from women travelers begin? And how do their observations differ, if at all?
I think our first female traveller that I can think of is Lady Mary Montagu, I think.
Yes, yes.
So that's late 18th century. If I remember, her husband's a diplomat, and she travels quite extensively and writes a series of letters which are later published in a very important book. She also does the usual round of trying to acquire as much as possible in terms of antiquities and build up a collection. She's pipped at the post at various points by people, by other travelers. Very few others, though, I can think of at all until really well into the 19th century. One thing, of course, that Montagu gives us that others cannot is the female spaces in the East. She can go into the baths. Athens was in the Ottoman period absolutely full of bath complexes, and of course they're segregated by sex. And she has interesting things to say about how the women, when they undress, what they are wearing and how they are bathing themselves and covering themselves in perfumes and so on. She's quite shocked by a lot of it, in fact. But of course, you never have any of that from the male travelers. Of course, they can't get anywhere near.
Right. So those are ways. There was also after her in the early I think the early 19th century, maybe actually 18th century, Lady Elizabeth Craven, who came to Athens, again, I think together with a male traveller, but who, as you said, also wrote quite extensively in the tradition of the picturesque tradition, but she wrote about the experience of the female community in the baths of Athens. And you often find, I think, also in the accounts of male travellers that they admit to not being able to know too much about the life of women. So we have this gap where they say, well, the women will come out at night, for example, travel of the 16th, 17th century, and gather together. And so these early female travelers who did increase in number, I think, Lady Montagu, Whitley Montagu, started a sort of a sense that you could travel to Greece, you could travel to these lands, and do so safely, and there were things to see here, and maybe also spaces and experiences that only women could access just because they were close to men, because of those gender divides at the time as well.
Indeed. Yeah.
Okay, I've got another question here that's come up about the Parthenon itself, I think, which relates back to the fascinating visuals we saw of the Parthenon drawn in previous periods. And this is from Rick Neville, who asks, was the Parthenon relatively intact until the munitions explosion? So what sort of had it suffered before that time, and how, apart from, let's say, the obvious gaping hole that we see now, was there any other damage that occurred because of this explosion?
The Parthenon architecturally had essentially survived. It had gone through at least 2 fires that we know of by the Roman period. So its interior and roof probably looked very different, even when Pausanias was visiting in the 2nd century. But it was then, of course, turned into a cathedral, and there was a certain amount of destruction of the sculptures, and an apse was punched into the east end of the building, creating quite a bit of damage there. And then it was, of course, subsequently turned into a mosque with further alterations. But yes, I'd say essentially the shell of it, at least, its walls and its columns were pretty intact by the time of that explosion. It just hadn't had its original roof for quite some time. And of course, all of these travelers try and see it. They're not all successful, because it was quite difficult to get onto the Acropolis, as it was an Ottoman garrison. It was not only the chief fortification, but it was where the military officials and officers and soldiers lived with their families. So it was quite difficult to get to. And you had to pay a lot of money to get in. You had to bribe or give gifts to the governor, and so on.
This brings me on to another question, which I'll just throw in here before you continue, which is actually from Jennifer Niels, who says, do we have any definitive evidence that Stuart ever got onto the Acropolis, since the first volume of Stuart and Revett publishes only monuments in the lower city? So just wanted to throw that in there, because you're talking about this difficulty of access.
Yes, it does look like they got up to the Acropolis, but they did not publish those drawings from the mission immediately. There is quite a discussion clearly goes on between them and indeed the dilettanti who put up the money, of which monuments to publish and when. No, that first volume doesn't you don't get an enormous amount of the Acropolis, but I think it's not necessarily because they didn't go up there, but they certainly wouldn't have got up there as much as they liked. We know that. And when Revett goes back with Pars on the second Ionian mission, they do an awful lot more drawings that are then cobbled together with the earlier ones. that enormous series of the dilettanti publications. I mean, it wasn't finished until about the 18 teens, very, very, very lengthy amount. And there's still papers in the British Library that are unpublished. There's an awful lot of drawings, yeah. But yeah, it was very difficult to get onto the Acropolis. And I think, was it Revet even that had, or Pars that had problems, because they erected scaffolding to go and take measurements and drawings. And the Turks tried to stop him because he could look down to the courtyards of people's houses where the women were.
Right. Interestingly, takes us back to that idea of the slightly separate spheres and what you're allowed to see and what you were not allowed to see. And maybe how also what you saw was also controlled by the people who you were with or who you had to deal with in terms of getting access, and maybe people who also guided you as well, what they allowed you to see and not. Moving on to the question of let's say the political and philosophical interests, a question from Barbara Stetson about the degree to which travelers were interested in the concepts of Athenian democracy. So in terms of their fascination with the antiquities and with ancient Athens, how much of that was impelled by an interest in Athenian democracy, would you say?
I'd say not very much, to be honest, at least from the earlier centuries. Classicists or people with a classical education tended to look to Sparta for the example. Democracy wasn't quite as in vogue in that earlier period, and it was really, I think, probably only with the great revolutions that swept Europe that people started turning instead away from the Spartan form of regime towards an understanding of the Athenian democracy. And indeed, they have quite some difficulty locating anything on the ground associated with the Athenian democracy. The Athenian assembly place, the Pnyx, isn't identified really accurately till the late 18th century. And I wonder if part of that is a slight lack of interest in it. They come to Athens in terms of what they're hoping to see. It's really for the monuments and the art that they're more interested in. I don't get a lot of sense from the travelogues of an interest in, say, ancient Greek politics. Philosophy, yes, much more so, but I think it would probably surprise most modern readers, the lack of democratic interest.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, I remember reading Pope's letters to Lady Mary Wortley Montagu as she's traveling, and he talks about the way that literature will be coming alive. You will now be reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, and because you are in these places, you will have another type of experience. They will come alive more fully for you. So maybe that was another interest in actually going to the city, particularly for those with this sort of classical reading and education as well. Yeah. An interesting question has come up, sort of taking us slightly forward from the time. John Pizarro says, when did the first writings appear of travelers who use motorized transport, and how does that change travel reports?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one. I don't think we have. There's very little that I can think of, or at least it really makes it terribly, at least becomes terribly famous.
I think for a long time, even into the 19th century, you're still hearing about people traveling by horse over rough terrain. So you'd have to come into the sort of kind of early 20th century, sort of mid 20th century, even maybe
I'd say more towards the mid, because just as you know, there weren't the roads for motorized vehicles outside of a select few. Yes, I can't tell you more about that, I'm afraid. a bit later than I know about. But I certainly have friends who traveled around Greece in the 1950s who say that it was by car extremely difficult even then. And if you wanted to go to the Peloponnese from Athens, that was a several day journey.
Yeah. And if you think about the text like Patrick Leigh Fermor's text on Mani, I mean, a lot of that is by boat or on foot still. There still remain these areas of the country which were quite difficult to penetrate, even well into the 20th century, which maybe also kept their charm. Leigh Fermor was horrified by the developments of tourism within the area that he loves so much. Okay, and I've got here actually a question or comment from Angelos Papadopoulos, our colleague at CYA, who thanks you very much for the informative lecture and asks if the published information and notes played any role in the shaping of the Archaeological Service and the Athens Archaeological Society after the War of Independence.
Yes, certainly. I mean, the first archaeologists of the modern Greek state were some of the biggest names. Pittakis, you think of a bit later, Strathiades. There were some extraordinary people, and the earliest ones provide a very interesting overlap. Pittakis, Kyriakos Pittakis, I think was he the first ephor, the first director of the new archaeological service? He himself had fought in the War of Independence, and he'd been taught as a young man, or maybe even a boy, by Fauvel, the French consul. So there's rather nice overlap there between the world of the travelers and the modern Greek state. Otherwise, there's quite a divide between the two. We're now in quite a scientific environment. A lot of the Greek archaeologists are educated abroad with very wide knowledge of the modern academic discipline, and the writings of, let's say, the 1830s, 1840s are really substantially different from the early travelers, and you start to get, in Greece at least, an enormous volume of collecting. People are going around Athens, Pittakis, and Rangavis, Rangabe, he's published in French, collecting enormous amounts of stuff, because now that you've got a burgeoning urban infrastructure getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the damage to the antiquities is colossal. And the job of a lot of these early Greek archaeologists is to try and salvage what they can. And again, they're very interested in inscriptions. Pittakis and Rangavis, between them, thousands and thousands and thousands of inscriptions they copy in people's gardens and walls, and while roads are being dug up, and so on. Had they read the earlier travelers? Yes, some of them certainly, absolutely. But there is definitely now a move towards something quite different.
Right. Do you think, I think it's very interesting, the debate you went into between Spon and Le Guillotière, pardon my terrible French accent, concerning the sort of element of fantasy within travel writing. Of course, this has got a long history. I mean, we can go back to Mandeville's travels and say that in some way travel writing has always sort of kind of had this association in some ways with fiction as well as fact, in some sense, of sort of capturing observations, but also of narratizing them. And there's always been this debate about how far, when you're writing also travel writing, how far you can actually have some sort of poetic license to fictionalize certain things. Do you think that sort of some of the later travelers were also looked at these earlier writings in a sense as they were looking at them both as fictionalized accounts as well as sort of for their factual accuracy? Do you think that still, as we look at them as students or out of interest, we need to be aware of these tendencies as well? Or do you think that it's quite clear, let's say, which ones we can trust more fully if we...
Yeah, I think it's
the idea that we can trust some more fully than others.
I think it's pretty clear. Yeah, there's quite a dividing line, I'd say, between them. The travelers that I've talked about. Okay, they got things wrong, of course, but you don't get much of a sense that they're actually deliberately making stuff up. But clearly, people did, as we've mentioned with that book of Guilletin, his alleged brother. The brother didn't exist either, by the way. That is part of a very common series of totally invented travel literature from the 17th century, 18th century. There's quite a lot of that. There's a slightly related genre of people who are generally trustworthy, but then make up antiquities.
Right.
Rather than stories. There's a French man, the Abbé Formant, who comes to Greece in 1728, 29, 30. And he does very well in Athens and records many thousands of monuments and is very important. But then something happened and he goes to Sparta and he completely invents hundreds of inscriptions that never existed. And people wonder why. And I think it's all to do with the fact that you had to show off all of this when you got home.
Right.
And in the salons of Paris and the academic and amateur societies, I think he probably just wanted a bit more fame. And so he invented relationships between the Spartans and the Israelites and things like that that were just utterly impossible. He was eventually found out by the Englishman Payne Knight, mostly because he completely invented a series of Greek official titles based on orders of French nuns.
Wonderful.
Caught out.
Wonderful. Okay, I would like to thank you very much, Robert, for the very, very informative lecture delivered with all your natural verb and wit and insight, and for the discussion. And I would also like to thank everybody who's followed the lecture and discussion today. And I'd like to pass the floor over to Mr. Philactopoulos for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Robert. You did a marvelous job today. Very enlightening, very interesting lecture. When the question about the motorized later travelers came up, I thought maybe we should try to do something in the future about such people as Henry Miller and Horace Darrell and Patrick Lee Fermor, and God knows. There's a lot of interesting material there. I know this was not your topic today, so what you showed us was fascinating. Thank you very much. This is going to be an interesting July for us with this lecture series we've started. Next week on Wednesday, 15th July, at the same time, 7 p.m. in Greece, 12 noon Eastern Daylight Time. We will have CYA trustee, Christine Contoleon, chief curator at the MFA in Boston, and along with CYA alumna, Phoebe Seagull, who is curator on the art of ancient Greece and Rome at Boston Museum of Fine Arts again. And they will take us on a virtual tour of some magnificent works of art at the MFA. And then the week after, July 22, we will be virtually joined by former professor of CYA and very much of an advisor of CYA, Michael Hertzfeld. Professor Hertzfeld, who is professor of social sciences at Harvard University's Department of Anthropology. The discussant will be CYA professor of anthropology, Amy Pleikas. Michael's topic will be stereotypes and realities, reflections from rural Greece. Please save the dates, and we hope to see you there in these two coming events. Before closing, I want to say one more thank you to our in-house director and the person who puts it all together, who is Billy Simopoulos, our development officer. This is not just, it's not a suggestion. He just happens to be a development officer. Well, anyway, thank you all very much. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.